Good morning, everyone. Happy Valentine's Day. And welcome to our 9 o'clock briefing, Music's Healing Power and Cultural Foundation. We have 3 speakers on our briefing today. They are Psyche Loui, Assistant Professor of Creativity and Creative Practice at Northeastern University, Elizabeth Margulis, Professor of Music at Princeton University, and Daniel Levitin, Founding Dean of Arts and Humanities at Minerva Schools at KGI in San Francisco. So we'll get started now by hearing their remarks, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you for coming, everybody, on this Valentine's Day. So I thought I would start by giving a little overview of my talk, which is going to be later today. So the title is Music and Emotions, Insights from Musical Anhedonia. So first of all, I think I'll say a little bit about brain imaging findings that we've had a couple of years back now. Can I just see by a show of hands how many people get chills or strong emotional responses when they listen to music? Okay, so that's kind of why you're here, right? So particularly, we were interested in seeing whether there were any brain differences between people who consistently get chills or strong emotional responses or goosebumps or physiological changes when they hear music that they really like, compared to people who don't particularly experience these feelings. And so what we saw was that the auditory areas in the brain were actually structurally more connected to areas of the brain that are important for emotion and social processing. Put simply, music is really a way to use your auditory channel to get towards the social and emotion centers of your brain. And so I think that's actually particularly appropriate considering it's Valentine's Day, to think that if you really love someone, you make them a playlist, right? So after that paper came out, one particular individual got in touch with me, initials are BW. He said that he has this condition known as musical anhedonia, which is a recently coined condition of people who don't get rewards when they listen to music. In other words, these are people who like good food and poetry and long walks on the beach as much as anybody else. They just don't understand why people like music. So we scanned his brain, and sure enough, the auditory areas were differently connected with the reward centers of the brain. And this is compared against a large group of controls. And this is using a magnetic resonance imaging. So from there, we started asking, okay, so what is it about music that seems to be so related to the reward system? And specifically, it seems to be a kind of reward that is tied to social bonding, right? So after all human societies use music in the group setting. And so we started asking whether, on the flip side, whether musical anhedonics might also have less rewards in response to social stimuli. So in other words, whether they're less pro-social. And this is the very, very new finding coming out last week in my lab. We've surveyed a large sample and found some people who fit criteria for having musical anhedonia, and we see indeed that they are less sensitive to social rewards, even without musical stimuli per se. They're less likely to enjoy hanging out with other people, tend to be less pro-social than their musically hedonic.
In other words, math professors.
We didn't actually survey them for math ability, but we did also show that, find that this is not about musical ability, right? This is not, that people with musical anhedonia are not tone deaf, right? They're not worse at music, but they just don't have as much social rewards as most the rest of us. So I think that's my newest finding. I think I'll stop there.
Hi, so the talk that I'm going to be giving this afternoon is very much about music as a really interesting site of connection between deep internal structure and deep cultural embedding. That seems really important as we think about music's potential use in clinical and health settings. And I'll just give you a couple of examples about what I mean. Those of you who have been subjected to something like a music theory course in your life know that there's a lot of intricate structuring involved in all kinds of musical styles that's interesting and matters for our perception and experience, including our very hedonic experiences of the kind that Psyche was talking about. But this is also modulated in really important ways by experience and the social kind of setup of the musical presentation that a person is having. So I'll just give you one brief example where we had people listen to excerpts of music in an fMRI scanner, and it was often the same piece, in fact, the same performance, but we just told them in advance that they were going to either be hearing a conservatory student of piano or a world-renowned professional pianist. And we could see some of the reward activity, again, that Psyche was talking about, beginning even before the music started, when people had a particular expectation about what they were going to hear, like that it would be this amazing professional. And then that really colored everything about how they apprehended the actual acoustic content of the music that they were listening to. So one of the ways we've been addressing this situation, aside from just sort of setting up these kinds of different experiences in a laboratory setting, is traveling to different places in the world where people have very different musical experiences, and trying to really understand the relationship between what's happening in musical structure and what's happening in the set of listening experiences that people are bringing to that listening session. So one of my favorite examples comes from some work that we've been doing in rural China, where we're finding that when we play people excerpts of music that don't have any words at all, that are of various types of music from various places in the world, that people within a community will tell us give us very coherent accounts about the kinds of imagined stories that they're experiencing while listening. So the sense you might have when you hear the Psycho theme or something, that something terrible is going to happen. And so there are certain excerpts where we can find incredible amounts of consensus within a place and really interesting differences across places. So there's an example that I'm thinking of that's atonal. So it doesn't have that sense of home pitch that you can relate the different harmonies you're hearing to, and people who really expect tonality. So people, if you sample people in Michigan, say, will tell you that this excerpt sounds like something horrible is going to happen. Someone's about to get murdered. It's horrible. And if you play it to people in a place where tonality is not a thing they're seeking out, it's not the norm against which this atonal excerpt is marked, they'll tell you that it sounds like kids going out and playing with their friends happily, enjoying games together. Because there's this sort of staccato articulations, very short, detached, that can read as playful if you're not stuck in this idea that it's lacking this tonal center. Okay, move
Um, I'm chairing the symposium, and I couldn't be more delighted that the first two people that I asked to be part of it agreed. Psyche and Elizabeth are two of the world leaders in studying music in the brain and trying to map out the different parts of the brain that are involved in the field that you might call neuroaesthetics, or the cognitive and affective neuroscience of music. And the aim of the session was to present some new work and to frame some old work so that we together could take a look at where the field is going and what kind of work needs to be done in, say, the coming 5 or 10 years to really push things forward. This is a rather old drawing of the brain, but it illustrates that the entire brain is involved in music, not just one section. And in fact, we could color in all the other sections with what we've learned since then, but it would make the figure kind of hard to read. Mm-hmm. These are the main areas. We all study musicians, sometimes professional musicians, sometimes amateur musicians. We scan their brains, or we are informed by their experiences and questions about what we need to be asking that we might not be asking. And to that end, we have a professional musician who will be joining us today, not this fellow, but a guitarist named Brian Nova, who's one of the great jazz guitarists in the world, a protege of both Herb Ellis and Joe Pass, and he'll be bringing his perspectives. As I say, the professional working musicians often ask us questions that cause us to think differently about things because they've got a different insight. I've spent some time over the last few years trying to popularize the science of music and the science of neuroscience, and these are some of my books. And what I'm hoping that you'll all get out of this session with us now and out of the session this afternoon, if you are able to come, is an overview of where the field is at through the brains of two of the leaders of it, and what's new and what we hope to find. The word health is in the title because I think one of the three of us agree, I think that one of the underexplored areas is whether music actually does have effects on health that are differentiable from other things that might be amusing or enjoyable, and what the neurochemical and HPA axis, what might be the effects on immune system function and pain perception and things like that. It's, as I say, an understudied topic. It's been hobbled by a lot of really sketchy work over the last couple of decades of non-rigorous studies not being done by careful investigators, but that's changing, and it's changed quite a bit in the last 5 years. And so we are beginning to see that it's real and to understand it. So with that, I'll turn things over to all of you.
Great. Thank you so much. And now we'll take your questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll bring you a mic and kindly state your name and affiliation before your question. I think our first question's here in row 4.
Thanks very much. Robin Williams from ABC in Australia. It's quite well known that people who sing in a choir get great benefits singing together, and oxytocin, that favorite hormone.
The love hormone for Valentine's Day.
That's right, exactly why I mentioned it, predictably. But when you're playing music, I can understand that there'll be various brains which won't react to things like Eminem during the Oscars, or maybe Achy Breaky Heart. But what if you play the Bach Mass in B minor? Have you got variety of music that has different effects? Have you tried that?
Absolutely. I think thank you for that question. I think it's really important to consider context and the upbringing and cultural background of the participants when we're doing these neuroscience studies. And so that's why we always go through individual subjects' favorite playlists. Right, so, I mean, at the end of the day, what activates your reward system will be music that you enjoy, which you're better at telling me than I'm at telling you, even with some music theory background, right? I think that it's very interesting to see how different cultures vary in what music they find to be most interesting. But what we're seeing now is that there are structural commonalities, and I think that part of what makes music so rewarding to listen to, even new music, even music you haven't heard before, is this interplay between prediction and reward, right? So because we are living and walking around in this world that has lots of music in it and has structure in that music, we tend to have expectations for those structures, and it is this systematic interplay between those expectations and the violation of those expectations that engage the reward system. So I think it is something that's quite general, but it is also something that's specific because it depends on the environment in which we live.
If I could add, we had done a study where we tried to block the brain's reward system with a drug called naltrexone, which blocks transmission of opioids in the brain's own endogenous opioids. And the subjects in our experiment got either a blocker pill or an inert placebo, didn't know, and they brought in their favorite pieces of music, and they didn't feel any pleasure from that. But as a control, we played each subject the music that somebody else brought in. So somebody who says, I'm bringing in my favorite piece of music and it's by Eminem, but I'm not enjoying it right now with this system blocked, also didn't enjoy Bach. I mean, it does get to the centrality of the reward system not having its own. I mean, certainly we have our own musical preferences, but in these cases of extreme anhedonia, the channel seems to be utterly blocked. But who knows? There might be one piece of music that can worm its way in.
Yeah, this is
and maybe it's achy breaky heart.
Yeah, I wanted to say I love this design where you bring in your favorite music and that becomes the control stimulus, like for somebody else, and then you're really looking at what's going on.
Okay, we have a question here in the second to last row.
Hi, Ashley Hamer. I'm with Discovery and the Curiosity Daily podcast. My question's mostly for Elizabeth. The thing you mentioned about playing a piece of music for someone and telling them whether that it was either a conservatory musician or a professional musician made me immediately think about the pushes that people have had to get more diversity in orchestras and have more women and people of color. And a lot of what they're doing is having auditions behind screens so that you can't even tell who's playing. How much of your research has expanded into like the professional realm?
Yeah, so I think the kind of manipulation that we were doing is so crude in many ways, right? It's just like telling you that it's a professional or telling you that it's a student, whereas that's just a proxy for these very complex real world cues we're getting from all these kinds of factors about how a space looks, who's coming on stage, and how that's situated in relation to people in the audience. The best kind of real world example I can think of is that Washington Post experiment where they put the renowned violinist Joshua Bell in the Washington, D.C. metro, and they're the same sounds, right? Same sounds that are so riveting when people are listening to it at Carnegie Hall. We're just, people weren't able to cue into this gratifying aspect of those in a different kind of contextual setting. So I do think I'm somebody who actually I started out going as a pianist at a conservatory, and one thing that was so interesting to me and kind of pushed me into this line of work, I suppose, is this idea that we were so obsessed with the note-to-note relationships and what was happening when it seemed so apparent that it was such a richer, more complex, and in some cases problematic situation than that.
Great. Okay, so we have questions in the back, and then we'll come to the second row.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Christina with the German News Agency, and this is for you, Psyche. I was wondering, this condition of musical anhedonia that you were talking about, do you have any information or ideas or just, thoughts about how prevalent is it, how big a percentage of the population might have this condition?
Sure. So in 2013, there was a large screen done on a couple thousand people over a few experiments, and the reported incidence is less than 5%. So somewhere between 1% and 5%. And then there was another study that analyzed specifically brain damage patients to see whether there were any systematic brain damage that can be linked to musical anhedonia. And out of 70 people with different kinds of brain damage, they only found one case. Right? So it's really quite rare, and it seems like the acquired or due to brain injury, musical anhedonia due to brain injury might be even more rare than just individual differences in musical reward sensitivity. That's at the tail end of a spectrum.
Okay, another question in the back, then we'll come up.
I'm Arthur Landwehr with German Public Radio. It's a question for Daniel. Since you did research on the effect music has on Alzheimer patients, could you elaborate a little bit on your findings, what you found out on the physiological level, maybe?
I want to be clear here that I haven't done any empirical work on my own, but I've been making an effort to compile and understand the work of others on the topic. I think that the profound problem that many Alzheimer's and dementia patients face due to extreme memory impairment, which appears, you ask about the physiological basis, as is now believed, there are tau proteins and neurofibrillary tangles that effectively alter the normal transmission of information in the brain. Stan Prusner, who got the Nobel Prize for discovering prions about 20 years ago, now has strong evidence that he just published in October that prions, or misfolded proteins, are associated with and may even cause some of the memory deficits in Alzheimer's. And there's also hippocampal shrinking in Alzheimer's patients. So that's the physiological level as far as we know. The interesting thing about music is that it seems to use phylogenetically older pathways than speech or facial recognition or other things. We don't know why that would be, but because they're evolutionarily older, they're more resistant to transmission difficulties and other physiological deficits in the brain. And moreover, music is a unique stimulus in terms of how it's represented in memory, because it's represented in multiple ways. There are parts of the brain that might store the rhythm independent from the pitch or the timbre or the contour or the melody or the harmony, and there are other parts of the brain that bring it all together. But the idea is that if you can cue just one or two of those systems, it can activate the other systems. You know, we think of the brain as like circuits now more than particular regions. So if you can find your way into the circuit, you can open up a lot of possibility. And I just wanted to say, phenomenologically, the problem that Alzheimer's patients face with this loss of memory is that they're very disoriented. They're typically in a home or a facility. They don't remember how they got there. They don't recognize it. It's new to them. They don't know the faces of the people they see every day in the facility. They don't recognize the faces of a spouse of 50 or 60 years. That leads to a great deal of agitation and turning inward because they can't trust the outside world. But music, if it's familiar to them and it opens up these pathways, has the profound effect of putting them back in touch with themselves, of rediscovering who they are, rediscovering their own memories. And that's huge. It has led to a number of findings of decreased agitation, increased neurochemical structures that support healthy immune system function, so fewer health problems.
Yeah, so if I may add to that, I think it's this idea of familiarity in music is a really important piece of the puzzle, I think, for why music might help people with Alzheimer's. In 2015, there was a really great paper published where they looked at brain differences between when you're listening to familiar music and unfamiliar music. And so that contrast, right, the effect of familiarity showed up in a couple of regions in the brain, specifically the anterior cingulate. And then these same researchers looked at the metabolism differences in older adults who have Alzheimer's. And it turns out that that particular area, the anterior cingulate, was spared, quite selectively spared in metabolic impairments in these patients with Alzheimer's. So this is suggesting that familiar music may be a unique way to get at the brain in a way that's different from other forms of stimulation. So I think that there's a really wonderful movie called Alive Inside that's specifically about music and memory and their role in Alzheimer's disease. And I think it really gets at a lot of what we're interested in here. Yeah.
I think we had a question in the second row. The mic is coming to you right here. Yeah, thanks.
Hannah Geisler, Daily Express. I think in one of the sessions it mentioned in the description the idea that music could help wounds heal faster. I just wondered if there's any research you can talk about on that.
There's some emerging research that music can help wounds to heal faster, and I would call it preliminary. No meta-analysis yet, not well replicated, but I mentioned it in my talk just as a tantalizing direction of something that needs to be explored more. The plausible mechanism would probably be that music enhances mood, and enhanced mood modulates. I should just say, there are like 100 neurochemicals, and we only know about a little about maybe 8 of them. And so we tend to oversimplify and say that dopamine and serotonin are responsible for everything, but it's like the drunk looking for his keys under the lamppost, even though he didn't lose them there, but the light is better. So we've got the tools to study dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin, and so we talk about them, but I think in the coming 10 years, the story will become much more nuanced and interesting. But we know that boosting levels of serotonin increases production of T cells and NK cells, natural killer cells, which are kind of like the James Bond of the immune system. They go after the more difficult cases. So the plausible mechanism there is simply mood elevation, but we're not sure.
I mean, I think there's something to be said about not so much wound healing, but pain perception. There's some results. So psychologists have these diabolical ways of inducing pain and then seeing how that, how the perception of pain differs with these different experimental manipulations. And so one of these diabolical ways is you put your hand in an ice bucket and you wait, and you see how long someone can wait before withdrawing their hands. I think there was some results from, I think it was Goldsmiths University in London, that showed that after making music together, you actually left your hand in the bucket for a little bit longer, right? So suggesting that there's really a change in your pain sensitivity.
McGill.
Okay.
Yeah, it was my work with Mogul.
I think I think there might be a few, but it's there's also Robin Dunbar's group, and then also I think Lauren Stewart might have been part of that. So.
And I would add that there's an inflammatory component to wound healing, and some music under some conditions can reduce inflammation.
And given how important familiarity is, the way Psyche was talking about, and exposure and the kinds of experiences you've had previously, there are increasingly good methods for measuring and tracking, disturbingly or not, the music people have been listening to over time. So that's going to allow these kinds of health interventions to be based more rigorously on the individual kinds of experiences that people have had coming into the treatment.
Could imagine Alexa injecting just the right music into your household when you need it.
How embarrassing, Psyche. I will look at the Lauren Stewart work.
Daniel, you mentioned that musicians are asking you all questions that cause you to think differently about the work. What are some of those questions? What are the things that they're asking you that change how you think about future research?
Sometimes it's just an experimental design thing, where a musician will visit the lab, a professional musician will visit the lab, and they'll want to run through the experiments we're doing, and they'll say, oh, well, why don't you add this condition? Why don't you, and the condition might be something like a different instrument, or speeding it up or slowing it down. I'll give you one example. We were running an experiment on emotion perception in music, where we took piano pieces by Chopin as performed by a concert pianist, and we extracted the duration of the notes and the amplitude of the notes in solo piano, and then we're able to manipulate them. So what characterized the Chopin performance is that some notes that were written as quarter notes were played much longer than quarter notes, others were played much shorter. Think of Für Elise. If you were to play it as written, it would be da 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 da, and nobody does that. You go dee da dee da dee da, or something. I mean, you're the pianist, but something like that. You have a better rendition?
I loved yours.
So the question was, is that variability that a pianist naturally adds something that is conveying the emotion, or is it something else, the variability in timing and amplitude? And so we removed all the timing and amplitude cues and created versions that were perfectly robotic. We had a version as performed, and then using a computer and MIDI, we reintroduced variability, so we had a 25% version, a 50, and a 75% version. Steely Dan, the band, came to the lab while we were doing this experiment for a visit, and they said, why did you stop at 100%? What would happen if you pushed it out to 125 and 150? Maybe more is better. And so, that changed things.
Yeah, or something that's been inspiring us a lot lately are film music composers who think all the time. I mean, you can look at production libraries and kind of type in there, I'd like something that's bitter with a twinge of hope, and find, okay. So what's going on there? That just sparks new questions that would have been hard to think about without that perspective.
Question here, and then go to the back. Yeah.
Alexander Margulis from the Junior League of Reporters. I was wondering about the thing where music can make different people hear different stories. Is that in different places or in different economic statuses? Like, could film composers use, if it's in different places, do you think if it's telling different stories, could film composers tweak music so that it sounded differently on international films? Like, what would be the implications of different people in different places hearing different stories?
That's a great question, Alexander. So, so yes, I think that sort of the way you define a musical community or a culture need not be geographic, and you can find people, just look in New York City and find all kinds of different networks of people with very different kinds of listening biographies. So I think that's really insightful. I also think that film music is special because mass media has such a mass cultural force that you can find people in who have media exposure all over the world with a similar set of experiences and associations that's driven by mass media.
Well, I think the point is that if you were making a film for, say, a rural Chinese audience who had not been exposed to Western music, you would score it differently. Or if you were making a film that was meant to convey the Afghani experience to Afghanis, not to Westerners, you'd use different tropes and different musical memes in order to convey. As an example, in Western culture, we tend to think of a descending scale on a xylophone as somebody climbing downstairs from hundreds of Bugs Bunny films, where that's the association, but that's not universal. It's just a culturally learned thing.
We had a question here.
Hi, Vanessa Moss. I'm one of the NASW Travel Fellows. We've talked a bit about the influence of music on physical healing and physical pain. And Psyche, you mentioned that brain injury does not seem to incite anhedonia, but I was wondering if any of you could touch on the influence that music has on a traumatized brain.
I think that I'll start by saying that Peter Janata at UC Davis has done some very interesting work looking at the tracking of music with the medial prefrontal cortex, which is part of the default mode network, which tends to be active when you're not particularly thinking about anything. So over the past 10 years, there's been a lot of interest in the resting state of the brain, right? So it turns out that when you're not particularly thinking about anything, your brain is not active. There's still a lot of activity. And one of the, I guess, hubs of this activity is in the medial prefrontal cortex. And it turns out that, and this is Janata's work, when you're listening to music that particularly brings you back to a certain time in your life, for most people it tends to be in the adolescence phase, that tends to activate the medial prefrontal cortex. Also, when you're tracking music that is systematically changing in key, right, so there's changing in structure over time, you also use that same area. So I think that there's something to be said for using music to maybe bring out those specific memories and then see what you can do with it in a cognitive behavioral setting. But maybe, Lisa, you had more ideas about that.
Yeah, I really think that's one of the areas that is on the horizon for us. I think that's something that is really important that we don't know a lot about yet.
Actually, I will say that we have very, very, very new results, that so new that I wasn't even going to talk about it, but now I'm going to talk about it. But that's looking at resting state functional connectivity, right? So as I said, you're not, your brain is not active when you're not doing anything. So and it's in fact reflecting these resting state networks of the brain. And so what we're seeing is that people who are less musically rewarded, right? So who report less being rewarded to music tend to actually have an over representation of connectivity between auditory areas and frontal lobe areas. So specifically in the same areas that are near the medial prefrontal cortex. So and that's specifically related to an aspect of music reward that is mood regulation. Right, so I think that's really interesting, kind of to speak to that. So I guess it's on the horizon, as you said.
And imminently on the horizon.
Imminently.
And to speak to the trauma in more historic terms, of course, the Greeks used music to help to soothe people with psychic and physical injuries, and they had particular pieces of music that were sort of prescribed by a Greek doctor. And certainly since the 70s, I don't know of any rigorous work on this, but we kind of have a situation where, at least in the US and Canada, in Western Europe, since the early 70s, if somebody experienced a psychological trauma or a physical trauma and they went in for healing massage, there is this whole genre of music where, you know, we now have millions of people who were kind of informal subjects in these informal experiments, but they'll tell you, and the therapists will tell you, that this so-called New Age music really does have soothing qualities over and above what the massage itself has. In that respect, it's kind of like the old Gestalt psychology experiments, where they were never really run as experiments. They were just demonstrations with a bunch of people and no controls.
Question in the back, and then we have one in the second row.
Hi, I'm Amika Nolan from the Economist Science Podcast. Just to follow up on what you were talking about just then, in that kind of situation, would it be possible to know whether, with the New Age music, that the music has that effect because it's inherent to the music, or because we've been told that you should feel relaxed in this situation, and therefore you're just obeying this kind of socially constructed stimulus?
Well, I think one important way of getting at that is looking at people who have different kinds of expectations coming into it, right? And so that's where these new kind of global networks for running paradigms about music or about really anything in lots and lots of places at once will become really essential. And that's starting to happen a lot in music research.
And I think also translating it to how we make music is a really interesting application as well. So we not only now have the ability to sample more places in the world than we were able to before, we also can do new things with sounds in ways that we weren't able to before. So so I think that if we know enough about the brain, we can not only use music to help the brain as it is, but to make music that is then better for the brain.
When you're talking about psychological issues, I think the important thing is that there is no one technique or method that's going to work on everybody. So sometimes it's therapy, sometimes it's drugs, sometimes it's taking up meditation or yoga, or becoming involved in religion, or just getting a better group of friends who are more nurturing than the old group of friends you had. I mean, all these things are different pathways to reaching some psychological peace or state. And some people, you know, I live in California, which is sort of ground zero for people experimenting with different ways of reaching different states. So a lot of people go to sound baths or sound healing workshops having tried a bunch of other things, and the sound therapy works for them. And whether that's a combination of something intrinsic to the therapy or a cultural expectation is hard to say, but the fact that they've tried so many other things and then that worked suggests anyway that there's something to it, you know, that's real, and it's not just a placebo. But we don't know yet.
Question here.
Hi, I'm Claudia Lopez, one of the Science Writers Travel Fellows. So, based on the evidence that music helps with immune system function and Alzheimer's disease, do you see music being integrated into a clinical setting? And if so, in what capacity and sort of what that time frame do you think that is?
Yeah, I think that music is incorporated into clinical settings. I work in my lab with people who are trained as music therapists, and we're doing an 8-week intervention on people with mild cognitive impairment. And what we're seeing is that there are increases in brain activity and sensitivity to reward after those 8 weeks. And so I think it's really important to integrate music as part of clinical work. I think at this point it still really depends on the clinician, right, and who's prescribing. But I think in the future, right, can we start to ask about using music therapy as a kind of dosage? Like what would a dosage chart for music look like, right? Would there be a future day when you prescribe 10 minutes of Mozart listening, right, to a patient with Alzheimer's? I think we don't know, but I think that we're starting to find out that relationship and what that might look like. Yeah. And I'm also sure that it has to be individually tailored.
And just to put in a plug for basic science, since we are at the AAAS, it's going to be a tough battle to get HMOs and insurance companies to pay for music therapy unless we really understand the basic science of it. And speaking on behalf of the three of us and the 150 or 200 people in our field who do this pretty much full time, it is very hard to get funding to do this kind of work. It's just not seen as a priority, and so we all have to cobble together research dollars to do these experiments, but they're necessary in order to understand the underlying mechanisms without which they won't be accepted, and nor should they be. Fundamental science.
Yeah. So, thanks.
Hi, Muhammad Mansour from Egypt. There are many kinds of music, Eastern, Western, classic music, and so on. So, is there any specific type of music that have the ability to heal better?
So my, I guess, perspective on this is that the trick here at the core of everything is this interface between what's happening in the music itself, like Psyche was talking about, with this sort of structural predictions you're making and the violations the music is having a response to those. But those expectations are based on experience that you had previously. So there's just this really tricky thing to work out, which has to do with that structure and the experience that the listener brings to that structure. And I think that's the case for a lot of things out there in the world, but music's an especially kind of great domain to pursue those questions. It makes a really important I think, topic of inquiry for cognitive science writ large.
You talk about violations in the structure of music driving a response. For people in this room, for us, what are some of the violations in musical structure that you would imagine would drive the biggest response? What could you explain what they would look like in lay terms? Yeah.
Right. So the musically oriented people in the field might know that music, for example, at least Western music, there are certain chord structures, right? So if you're in C major, then you expect the song to end in C major, right? But sometimes instead of ending in C major, you might go into an A minor chord, right? So that's a deceptive cadence. And so when that moment happens, right, so the brain sort of goes, oh, well, that's interesting. So that's a kind of classic expectation violation that I'm talking about.
Another question in the front row. I think this will be our last one.
I'm Dalia Abdesalam. I work for Scientific American Arabic Edition. I just wonder who can decide about using music to heal. So is the patient should have in his mind should be aware of this, or the doctor, so the treating doctor can tell him to go and find some heal using music. Who can decide about this?
I love that question because, in addition to music's healing potential and, existing usages, there's also a relationship between music and really unpleasant, right? Like music and torture. And, so it's actually can be, go both ways. and so I think these questions of who is deciding and how we're conceptualizing these things are really serious. Yeah.
I believe that patients need to be their own advocates and that they need to do research on their own and go to their doctors. I mean, doctors need to stay informed of changing events, and doctors should be working with the music therapy community. And then patients need to go to their doctors and say, I know you prescribed this drug, but I read about this one. What do you think about that? Or I read about this alternative surgical procedure that sounds better to me. Can you give me your opinion? Or I heard that this music therapy might be a thing. Would I be a good candidate for it? I think patients have to be, particularly in our health system where doctors are spending less and less time with patients, patients have to come to the meeting informed.
I mean, yeah, I definitely think it is about having an ecosystem, right? A healthy ecosystem between the patient and the care providing team, right? So the question is, where are we in our ecosystem? And I think that there are multiple places in which we could work in the music into the clinical world, whether it's at the clinician level, whether it's at the, maybe there's, some hospitals, for example, employ music therapists, right? So as part of their routine, right? I think it could be at multiple stages, but it has to be about interaction between a few parties.
Yeah, but for example, for me, I never heard in my region, in the Middle East or Africa, about this opportunity in hospitals. So do any of you know or you collaborate with academics from the Middle East who are working on this?
I think that would be really important to do that. I think that the Society for Music Perception and Cognition, for example, we offer travel grants, right, for people from different countries that might not be as familiar with this work. And I think that that's one step towards bringing people from more parts of the world to understanding this research and potentially its impact on health. Yeah.
So you do that?
We already do that.
We're all members of the society. Two of you are on the board.
Yes, I'm the
She's
current
the president.
and Psyche is the board
media director.
member and
Yes.
media director.
There you go.
So it's a world. So we have a world map on the website. I know because I made the world map. And it does show the labs that are all around the world. And I think the travel awards especially are really for kind of. It's for leveling the playing field so that different people from different countries to learn more about the work.
So we need to rely on you as a journalist in the Middle East to put the word out that we would love to give a travel grant to people from your region.
To understand more, who is eligible for such a grant? Is it a medical student or a psychology?
I think these are decided on a case-by-case basis.
Yes.
All of the
Anybody
above.
would be eligible.
Students, yes, yeah. It doesn't have to be, but it could be a medical student. It could be a psychology PhD student. It should be somebody who's presenting research in the field and is interested in learning about that field, of course. But I think that's the scope right now.
And for professionals, people who are professional researchers or clinicians, they're welcome to come to the meeting. The meeting is open to everybody, even if they're not a member.
Yeah, and I think some of these initiatives for building these global research networks are not only about that, but also about just enriching conceptualizations of how this works in the field by having, more voices and more experiences.
Thanks, everybody. So it's just about 9:50, so we'll prepare for our next briefing, but thanks so much to all of our speakers for your insights and answers. That was very and exciting to hear more about. The researchers could be available for additional questions in a follow-up room across the hall. Room 208 can be available to you if you want to talk with them further. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.